this 1.5 mile strip of land in between these two rivers was the only block in the connection between all of the Great Lakes and the entire Mississippi, and then into the Atlantic Ocean. So it was a really vital spot for fur traders that wanted to bring their goods from the Great Lakes into the Mississippi, where they could then be brought elsewhere. And when Illinois was founded in 1818, the borders of the state were actually created because it was so important as a bridge between Lake Michigan and the greater Mississippi area. So in 1836, following the creation of the state, they created the Illinois and Michigan Canal, which got rid of the 1.5 mile land barrier. This might not sound important, but in an era before trains and cars, water was the main mode of transportation. So getting rid of this 1.5 mile strip of land was really important for moving goods. And the Illinois and Michigan Canal did just that. And you can see how that really small strip connected a large area. The gray and the green are the upper and lower Mississippi River Basin. And the orange area is the Great Lakes and the Great Lakes River Basin. So all of this colored area of the United States was now connected by water, which was super important. And this created a really large boom in the Chicago area population. The first picture at the top is an artist's interpretation of Chicago in 1830, where only 200 people lived here. And the bottom is just 70 years later in 1900, where the population of 200 had grown to 2 million, which I think is really shocking. And this unprecedented growth in a time where there wasn't really city planning led to a lot of problems for Chicagoans. First of all, just the sheer amount of people produced a lot of waste, all of which was dumped into the Chicago River. Additionally, the Union stockyards, which made Chicago the meatpacking center of the world, also dumped their animal waste and animal carcasses into the Chicago River. And after they got put in the river, well, if you remember from the natural flow, all of this waste got put right into Lake Michigan, which was also used for drinking water. And it got so bad that in the late 1800s, the US Department of Health declared a public health crisis. The mortality rate of Chicago was really high compared to other cities in the United States. And the solution to this was the Chicago Ship and Sanitary Canal, which was created by engineers and was constructed in 1900. So you can see at the top picture, that's a picture of the construction, and the Chicago Ship and Sanitary Canal still stands today. It's still being used for our waste management. And the bottom picture is a modern day picture. So it's largely unchanged. It's been expanded, but the canal itself has not changed. And you can see in this, it's a updated map of the way the Chicago River flows. Through the subcontinental divide, the Chicago Ship and Sanitary Canal tunnels through, and it allows water from the lake to flow into the Des Plaines River, which then goes into the Mississippi, and then it goes into the Gulf of Mexico. And this was really important because not only did it expand upon the trading connections, but it moved water from a drinking area into the Gulf of Mexico, which was not used for drinking. And it was quite successful. This graph right here is of the typhoid fever death rate. And you can see throughout the 1800s, there were various outbreaks. But following the construction of the canal in 1900, the death rate went down until it leveled off at around 0 in 1915. So the canal did a really good job in preventing disease from getting into our water system. And I just thought this was an interesting picture. It's from 1908, so 8 years after the reversal. People were using the water for recreation, which I think is really powerful considering how much they feared the river just 8 years before, and now it drew huge crowds. So although this all sounds really great, and it has been, I want to highlight that the canal and the reversal did not solve all of the problems that our river faces. So here's an old picture of Bubbly Creek in the early 1900s, which is in the the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago, and it got its name because it was infamous for its pollutants bubbling up from the bottom of the creek. And that picture is from the 1900s, and then the picture on the right is from 2008. So as you can see, pollutants still fester in our water, and the system is not perfect. So the first thing I want to talk about is the way that Chicago uses the ship and sanitary canal as a combined river and sewer system. This is really unique to Chicago. Most countries and cities in the developed world no longer combine their sewage system with their rivers. And you can see in the diagram on the right, waste being produced from houses, factories, all gets dumped into a reservoir where it's intended to be treated at a treatment plant. But if there's too much waste or any extra waste, it comes out of an outfall pipe and just gets spilled into the Chicago River. So the picture on the left is actually an outfall pipe from the city of Chicago. And this is happening in our river every time it rains or floods. This sign right here is put up by the city of Chicago. And in case you can't read it, it's on the north branch of the Chicago River, and it says, this outfall may discharge rainwater mixed with sewage during and following storms, and discharges may contain bacteria that can cause illness. And I think this is concerning, and it shows the way that our open sewer system is imperfect, and we still do not completely treat our sewage, and it's still flowing throughout our communities and our rivers. And just like the way sewage can spill into the river can also flow into our sewage system. So you may remember the floods that Illinois experienced in 2008. The bottom is a shot of Des Plaines during the floods of 2008. And many homes got sewage in their basements. And the reason for this is because the river water levels got so high that they backed up into the outflow pipes and flowed backwards into people's basements. So this is just another concern of our open air sewage system that combines with the river, and the Chicago Ship and Sanitary Canal is one of the biggest ways that the river is incorporated into our sewage system. A second risk that I want to discuss about the Chicago Ship and Sanitary Canal is the way that invasive species can use it to travel. So you may remember in the map before how great of a massive land area the canal was able to connect. And because of this, it served as a connection for invasive species to move between the river basins. The first of many species is zebra mussels, which were spread in the Great Lakes in the 80s. And by 1988, they were detected in the Ship and Sanitary Canal. And now they are manifested throughout the Mississippi River system. So just that small 1.5 mile block would have prevented zebra mussels from moving across 40% of the central or of the continental US's landmass. And these mussels are not just ugly, they cause $1.3 billion of damage a year, according to the Department of State, through clogging drains, through damaging ship equipment, and also their environmental impact. They're invasive species, and they're not native to the environment and can outcompete native species. And Cam Davis is going to talk about Asian carp a lot more later, so I don't want to get into too much detail, but I want to highlight that unlike the zebra mussels, which went from the lakes into the Mississippi, Asian carp are working their way up the Mississippi and pose a threat to the lakes. So the Chicago Ship and Sanitary Canal is a two-way street, and it provides ample opportunity for invasive species to spread, many of which we haven't even seen yet, and we can't predict what will come next. So with all of that being said and all of the problems, I want to talk a little bit about what's being done. So TARP, which stands for the Tunnel and Reservoir Plan, is Chicago's current largest project and investment into the system. And it's essentially a very large hole for sewage Construction began in the 1970s, and it's expected to be completed in 2029, costing over $3 billion. So it's really a massive undertaking, and certain parts of it are open now and operable. It provides extra space for floods for sewage to go into, and it has been successful, but it's not perfect. On the left, you can see this is a photo from 2013. And after TARP, the part that's open had filled up with water during a storm, excess sewage shot out of sewers in a geyser. That's in Wilmette. Also, it doesn't address the need for a barrier for invasive species, and the waste is still being untreated in our river system. It's just extra storage. So because of this, many have proposed more dramatic or complete solutions for cleaning up and protecting our river. So a re-reversal is one of these options. And while there's many different proposals for re-reversal, none of which are official, they usually include a physical barrier separating the river systems again. This would prevent any invasive species spread, and also could incorporate a separation of our river system from our sewer system, which would help protect communities and people from sewage getting put into their homes. But it would also protect the natural environment if sewage is being completely treated. So these are both really big projects. So I also want to just talk a little bit at the end about what we can do and how we have some power in this. So this picture right here is a park in Chicago's Chinatown, and it used to be concrete. And the problem with that is water that falls onto concrete goes right into a sewer or the river and causes flooding. And the Chicago Water District replaced it with a park and green space which can absorb water. And this is something that we can promote in all of our communities by increasing parkland. And it's also something you can do in your own backyard by replacing unused areas with native plants that can help absorb water. And finally, of course, voting. It's something that we can all do, we all should do, and every single official that we elect has some say in what we do with our water, where our water goes, and how we treat it. So before you vote in your next election, whether it's local or statewide, just read up on what the candidates think about our water system, what they want to do with it, and hopefully they have some plans for it. So that's all of my presentation, and Cam Davis is up next. Thank you.
So Mary Catherine, do you want to moderate, see if there's any questions first for Luke?
I think we're going to do questions at the end. So everybody, if you have any questions for Luke, please put it in the chat and we'll get to them at the end, as well as any questions for Cam or anyone else, just put them in the chat.
Thank
Cam,
you.
go ahead.
So I'm going to introduce Cameron Davis. So Cameron was elected to the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District Board of Commissioners in November of 2018. He's currently a vice president at GEI Consultants. Before going to GEI, coordinate the work. Oh, I'm muted. I'm muted. Okay. How do I get out of here? I don't know how to get out of here.
Oh, you're fine. We can hear you.
Okay. Okay, I'm not muted. So Cam was appointed by the Obama administration to coordinate the work of 11 federal departments and serve as a liaison to Congress on Great Lakes matters. As the senior advisor to 2 U.S. Environmental Protection Agency administrators, the administrators are the head of the EPA. So that's kind of a big deal. In Washington, D.C., his responsibilities included coordinating Great Lakes policy and more than $2 billion of investments to states, municipalities, tribes, businesses, and civic stakeholders to clean up contaminated sediments, restore habitat, work to get rid of invasive species, runoff reduction, and related water resource matters. So, and just as a personal matter, Cam was a colleague of mine, and I cannot tell you how important his role was in getting the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative up and running. This was instituted by President Obama in 2010, and it has given literally billions of dollars now around the Great Lakes to protect and restore water quality and habitats. And Cam, from my personal experience, was an absolutely tireless advocate for getting this legislation passed. So without further ado, I am going to introduce my friend and colleague, Cam Davis.
Thank you, Liz. Can you all hear me pretty well?
Yes.
Great. First thing I need to do and want to do is just say thank you. Thank you for the invitation, Liz. And thanks for the very kind words. You know, I think probably most people at the league know that you work for EPA, and they know that you chair the Environment Committee and know that you're engaged civically, but they likewise haven't seen the work that I've seen you do up front, up close and personal, to help save Lake Superior in particular, but really have a hand in all of the Great Lakes. So League of Women Voters, you are lucky to have Liz LaPlante within your ranks. She is just a dynamo. Heidi, thank you so much for everything you do and the league. You know, in this era of just wondering what's coming next in our lives, I sometimes feel like civic engagement is something that's looked upon as quaint, and you guys make it cool. The league makes civic engagement, it reminds people about how important civic engagement is. So thank you for everything you do. I love that you show up to our Metropolitan Water Reclamation District board meetings and you give us ideas on how to do things better. And if we're doing our jobs right as commissioners, we're listening, we're taking that advice, and we're running with it. And I have seen you all in action doing just that. So before we even get started with talking about the Great Lakes and the Chicago River, all of what we're talking about tonight and protecting these precious, magnificent, amazing water bodies for generations to come does not happen without that kind of civic engagement. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you for everything you do. Speaking of the Water Reclamation District, I understand that one of my colleagues, Commissioner Marcelino Garcia, is online somewhere with us tonight, listening to the presentation. So I wanted to make sure that I acknowledged him. Marcelino is a friend and a very smart cookie. So it's a joy having him on the board. And then I have the great privilege of working with Dawn Walker in my own office. Dawn is on as well tonight. And she is also tireless in making sure that we help people understand what the district does with your tax dollars, helps people understand how to make use of the district too, with all of its different programs. So Dawn is on tonight, and I wanted to make sure I introduced her. And Luke, thank you very much for that amazing presentation. You took a very complicated issue and distilled it down very, very well. You've done your homework. Let's talk about the Great Lakes. It's hard to find. In fact, I have never found in my 35 years of being a Great Lakes advocate, I have yet to find one person who hates or even doesn't like the Great Lakes. How can you not love them? Whenever you're near them, you look out over them and they just provide you a chance, even at the most basic level, to just clear your mind. It's like looking at a blank canvas, but we all know that it's really not a blank canvas, the Great Lakes. What you see in all their vastness is also accompanied by a tremendous amount of complexity. And it's really connected with a lot of the things that we find that are important in life. That is jobs, our local economies, fisheries that many of us use for subsistence, recreation. The list goes on and on and on. You know, as an environmental lawyer, I'm trained, as many of us are, to really almost with blinders on, look at the law and stick with the wording in a law in terms of what the direction of society ought to be. But I look at the Great Lakes in a very different light, which is that they have enormous spiritual value to all of us, not to mention serving as our life support system in this region. And the theme that I have for you tonight is that we need to think of the Great Lakes as our homes, literally and figuratively. Figuratively, just as we all live in homes and we need to reinvest in those homes for them to continue to take care of us, we need to reinvest in the Great Lakes. I think that there is often an assumption that the Great Lakes are so big that they can just take whatever we throw at them and they'll be just fine. They'll just kind of snap back and recover. We have learned over and over and over and over again, the hard way, that even though they look big and they hold quadrillions of gallons of water, they do not take what we throw at them very well. They are enormously sensitive to change. And we'll talk about some of those changes soon. So just as if we want our homes to take care of us, we need to take care of our homes. So go the Great Lakes. And literally, they're our homes. H for Huron, O for Ontario, M for Michigan, E for Erie, S for Superior. We live around the Great Lakes, the HOMES, those amazing lakes. And so in addition to thinking of ourselves as residents of Chicago or Park Ridge or Palatine or Des Plaines or Evanston or Rich Township or Calumet City, we also need to think of ourselves as residents of the Great Lakes region as well. And it's a very powerful region. The League of Women Voters, it has in its name voters. So I'm going to mention voting and politics momentarily here. When you take a look at any presidential election, we have many swing states in this region. And we've seen that play out time and time again. And so as we do our jobs to encourage civic engagement, like the League does, one of the things that we need to keep doing is voting. And Luke, that's one of the reasons I was so thrilled with your presentation, is because a lot of people forget when I'm asked the question, what can we do? What actions can we take? One of the most important is that 4-letter word, vote. Anyway, the Great Lakes seem vast, they seem infinite, but they're not. They really are finite. And one of the, if you look at the trajectory of the Great Lakes, from the time of pre-settlement through settlement to the 1800s and then the past 100 years and today, you see a very stark trajectory of one wherein white settlers and immigrants from other parts of the world have come in and extracted from the Great Lakes. And by extraction, it's about the water we take from the Great Lakes. It's also about the timber that was taken from the northern forests in the upper Great Lakes region. It's been about the iron ore that's taken from the Iron Range in upstate Minnesota. It's about lime and limestone from formations around the Great Lakes that was used as an ingredient along with iron ore to make steel. It's not an accident that we here in the Chicago region have been next door to, at one point, one of the biggest concentrations of steel making anywhere in the world. And it's not just about Northwest Indiana. Cleveland and Buffalo have also been large steel making operations and concentrations. Those forests that I just mentioned gave rise to, at one point, the largest concentration of pulp and paper mills around the world. And that is in Green Bay, or has been in Green Bay. And the list goes on and on. We're also known in this region, along with steel and along with many of the other things that I've mentioned. We're also known for beer, one of my favorite subjects. Why is that? It's because our region is situated at an intersection. We're close by to fields where grain is produced, which is really important for beer. It's also close to where the water is for beer. 90+% of what goes into a bottle or can of beer is water, and we forget that. So water has been a key ingredient for what has prompted the industrial revolution in our part of the world. That industrial base has gotten us through 2 world wars, and it has produced an immeasurable quality of life for us in this region. Along with that extraction and that resource intensive use, we've paid a big price. If you take a look at where our toxic hotspots are around the Great Lakes, it's not an accident that they are in areas where we continue to this day to have working rivers and harbors. And in many cases, pollution from those heavy industrial corridors was discharged into those working rivers and harbors. It often sank to the bottom of those working harbors and rivers where it stayed. And a lot of times those kinds of pollutants have been toxic in nature, like PCBs, where they recirculate through the food system and create health hazards for the ecology of the region, including us as human beings. And we have about 30 of what we call areas of concern or toxic hotspots around the Great Lakes. The one closest to us here in Illinois is Waukegan Harbor. Waukegan Harbor at one point was dubbed by the media to be the world's worst PCB mess. Literally half of the sediment in Waukegan Harbor was comprised of PCBs. The next time you drive on I-90, you take the Skyway going eastbound toward Michigan, you are driving through the Grand Calumet River, Indiana Harbor Canal area of concern. If you ever go north of the border from where we live into Wisconsin, chances, and you stay on I-94 or I-43, chances are you are going through a part of the Milwaukee area of concern. Green Bay, Detroit River, Saginaw Bay, Buffalo River, the Maumee River, which runs through Toledo, Ohio, into Lake Erie, the St. Louis River, in the Lake Superior Basin in Duluth. The list goes on, but we have many toxic hotspots around the Great Lakes. We are getting to the point, thanks to the work that Liz does and so many dedicated public servants at EPA and many federal, state, tribal, and local agencies, we are getting to the point where we are chipping away at the cleanups of these areas of concern. And there's a reason for that I'll get to toward the end of the discussion. I mentioned before that we have grain that we produce in this region that goes toward beer making. It also goes towards bread making and many other things. But again, along with what we've taken out, that grain, it has come with a price, and that price has often been the destruction of habitat like wetlands. Because we live in not just a region that's known for a clean, fresh water, 20-some% of the Earth's fresh surface water supply, we are also known as part of the breadbasket of the world. And the conversion of wetlands to agricultural areas is one of the prices that we have paid for that extraction. So wetlands are really important. They're marshes. They help purify water. They help reduce flooding. They are habitat for fish and wildlife. The list goes on of how important wetlands are, but we have lost a lot of them in this region, largely because of agricultural conversion, but also conversion to suburbs, conversion to even cities. Chicago is built on a network of wetlands, which is part of why we see some of the flooding and massive efforts to control flooding and to help improve water quality in this region as a job of the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District. In addition, we continue to see pollution coming not just from the end of a pipe, but we see it running off of our lands. A lot of times it's agricultural land, but it's also our urban lands, our suburban lands. And that polluted runoff can cause great problems. In August of 2014, not that long ago in the scheme of things, while I was with the federal government, I received an urgent call from the Congresswoman's office in Toledo saying, look, our whole Toledo metropolitan water supply has been shut down for the weekend because toxic algae has put human health at risk through our drinking water supply. We take it for granted in the Chicago region and many other places around the Great Lakes that because the Great Lakes are so vast, they will continue to supply clean, fresh drinking water for all of us whenever we want it, however we want it. But as the Toledo example taught us, that's not necessarily always the case. In that instance, a vast majority of the toxic algae in Lake Erie, the drinking water supply for Toledo in this case, came from washing off of farm fields, nutrients washing off of farm fields upstream on the Maumee River watershed and other watersheds as well in the area. What are nutrients? That comes from manure, it comes from other fertilizer as well. Fertilizer does a wonderful thing. It helps to grow crops that we need to produce food to eat. At the same time, too much fertilizer can have an unintended consequence, which is to wash off of rivers, off of farm fields into rivers and watersheds, where it then fertilizes algae downstream. And too much of a good thing can become a toxic thing. And that was the case as the Toledo incident showed us in 2014. So one of the big challenges we have around the Great Lakes is to make sure that we are reducing polluted runoff by creating buffers, that is green spaces that edge along our rivers so that they can filter out, like wetlands do, they can filter out that fertilizer and those nutrients before they wash down in excess to create toxic algae problems downstream. Now, toxic algae is not just a problem for the Maumee River watershed or the western basin of Lake Erie. We have also seen how toxic algae can create problems in Green Bay, the world's largest freshwater estuary, where we have seen what's called hypoxia, that is the absence of oxygen. When too much fertilizer creates excess algae, and that excess algae dies, it often sinks to the bottom of a watershed where it decomposes and removes oxygen from water. We don't want that. Just as we need oxygen to breathe, fish do too, even though we think of fish as being underwater and not needing oxygen, they do. So when we have hypoxia, that is the absence of oxygen in our water, it really hurts our aquatic life, hurts it badly. And in some instances, you hear hypoxia referred to as another term, which is called a dead zone. And one of the most famous or infamous dead zones is the one in the Gulf of Mexico because it's so large. We in the Chicago region produce nutrients that then wash through the Chicago River system into the Illinois River system, down the Mississippi River and into the Gulf. So as hard as it is to imagine, given that we're separated by about 1,000 miles, we are connected to the Gulf of Mexico, and we actually influence the water quality of the Gulf of Mexico with what we do here in the Chicago region. Climate change is another big influencer of Great Lakes health. As we have seen just over the past several years, we've had record, on a monthly basis, record high lake levels that have created immense storm damage, and has eliminated, in some instances, recreational opportunities. For example, in the neighborhood of Rogers Park, we have seen 2 to 3 recreational beaches wiped out, not to be replaced again in the near future. But climate change is also leading to the Great Lakes being among the fastest warming lakes in the world. And changes in temperature in the long run create a new mix of biota, a new mix of biological composition in the Great Lakes. In other words, climate change can create a more hospitable environment for invasive species in the Great Lakes. You heard Luke talk about zebra and quagga mussels before. We'll talk about Asian carp as well. But one of the key challenges is climate change and how we combat that and help the Great Lakes be able to adapt. I could go on and on about threats around the Great Lakes region and to the Great Lakes, but I don't want to, because at the end of the day, each one of those threats has a solution, has actually a multitude of solutions, but they all tie back to the thing I was going to mention toward the end of my talk here, and that is investments. As I said at the outset, if we want the Great Lakes to take care of us, we have to take care of them, and that takes money. So one of the programs that Liz mentioned at the outset is the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which has provided hundreds of millions of dollars in investments to help restore these amazing, magnificent water bodies. And we are at the point now where when the program launched, it was considered another environmental program, another federal giveaway. We are now at the point where, speaking from a nonpartisan perspective, Democrats and Republicans alike in Congress recognize the value of this critical program. But as important as that program is, and as much as it is showing results, it's not a program that is ever something that we can be assured will stick around forever. President Trump sought to virtually eliminate the program through proposed budget cuts in 3 of his 4 years. So we have seen how when people don't understand the program, they don't understand the results that it gets, and they don't understand how vital the Great Lakes are for drinking water and for our economy around this region, that program can be at risk of elimination. And that's something we cannot let happen. It's something that I know many of us work very hard to keep around. I know the league, many of the members of the league have been very engaged on this, and for that, I'm thanking you. That money, that pot, that trust fund, if you will, has been responsible for this region climbing back on top of the problems and conquering them that it has seen. I mentioned Waukegan Harbor before, once called the world's worst PCB mess. That area of concern is on the brink of being removed from the cleanup list. We've seen White Lake and Muskegon Lake, White Lake and Muskegon Lake on the other side of Lake Michigan be delisted. Deer Lake in the Upper Peninsula be taken off of the cleanup list because that restoration work is done thanks to the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. We are seeing how places that people thought would never be cleaned up ever are now being cleaned up and taken off the list. Not just sometime decades from now, but actually right now, thanks to those resources. And this is not just an environmental issue. When these places are cleaned up and they're put back on the grid, they create, they renew local economies, which, as we all know in this region, is absolutely vital. So I will close with that after one more minute. I do want to mention that turning our attention from the Great Lakes to the east to the Chicago River, it's really easy to forget that the Chicago River is more than just the Chicago River. The Chicago River is actually a critical choke point that connects 31 states. Think about that. A majority of the states within the United States of America have one thing in common, the Chicago River. Why is that? That's because the Great Lakes are a watershed surrounded by 8 states. And that watershed, the Great Lakes watershed, is connected to the Chicago River, which is then ultimately connected to the Mississippi River. And through the Mississippi River, connected to the Missouri and the Arkansas and the Ohio and the Tennessee and so many other rivers. I'm not even going to begin to name all of them, but all of them are connected by watershed through the Chicago River as a choke point. So as we heard in the presentation before, we are right to think of the Chicago River as a very special place, as unique. Not just to us, we're also right to think of the Chicago River as a charge for stewardship that we need to take very seriously, because there are 31 states, 30 states beyond just the state of Illinois, that depend on the healthy functioning of that river system. And that includes Asian carp, which I promised I'd mention. You also heard from Luke earlier that unlike a lot of invasive species which get into the Great Lakes, Asian carp have been moving up the Mississippi River, taking a soft right up the Illinois River and heading toward Lake Michigan over the past several decades. When we talk about Asian carp, there are actually several different kinds, but the 2 kinds that are in the news the most because of the potential for invasion by Asian carp are silver and bighead. Silver get irritated by the sound of jets and they jump far out of the water. They've been known to leap out of the water when jet skiers are jet skiing along the Illinois River and hit people in the faces, break noses, things like that. So they constitute not just an ecological health threat, but they actually constitute a public safety threat. Bighead carp is the other kind, and they tend to stay in the water. They are not as perturbed as much by the sound of outboard engines. But making sure that we reduce the likelihood of an invasion, if not even just constantly try to eliminate it, I think is one of the great remaining challenges of our generation, along with climate change and its impacts on our water bodies. There's a lot going on to beat back Asian carp. And after about 8 years of coordinating several federal departments to help keep them out of Lake Michigan, that work has continued even after I've been gone from the administration. And silver and bighead carp have been kept out in self-sustaining populations, which is one of the good news stories that you don't hear too often about, but we have to keep that fight up. I could keep talking and talking and talking about the Great Lakes. I think about them, I dream about them. I take my kids to the beach during the summer to them. And so it's one of those things that I could keep talking about, but rather than do that, I'm going to stop, or at least pause, and I would love to be able to answer questions, including one of the questions that I know led to tonight, which was about, the prospect of re-reversing the Chicago River. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luke and Cam, for those incredible presentations. So let's go to our audience for some questions. So first up, Madeline asks, is the lake level lower or higher than the river level? And I think this might be for Luke.
Yeah, so essentially what they did by building the canal is make the water level move down into a tunnel. So usually the water is not able to go against gravity, obviously, and move into the Des Plaines River. But by digging it, they made unless Cam knows a more detailed explanation, they allowed the water to move through the tunneling. And I do know that Lake Michigan loses significant amounts of water every year to the Chicago River and then to the Des Plaines River. So there is water moving, more water moving out of the lake than there is water moving into it right now.
In terms of the flow of the Chicago River, I also see a related question here about the reversal. It's something that's been discussed for years, if not decades. And, one of the things that we have to understand when we are thinking about the Chicago River is why Chicago is situated where it is, and why we have what we call a deep tunnel or a tunnel and reservoir plan, or TARP. Essentially Chicago was built in a very low-lying area, like many other Midwestern cities next to the Great Lakes. Chicago was built in an area that was swampy, in an area that was comprised of interstitial dunes. And so over time, Chicago has had to raise itself up. This past May, we had something really interesting happen. You'll recall we had the wettest May on record in this region. In fact, it was so wet that the Chicago River rose to the point where the river was actually higher than Lake Michigan. And for a while during those heavy rains, the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District could not undertake the last resort of what it does when we have a heavy rain, which is to open up the locks and the gates that lead to Lake Michigan to let water from the river out into Lake Michigan. That couldn't happen in May for the first time in modern history memory, if not ever, because the river, the lake levels were so high that if those gates and those locks had been opened, it would have had the opposite effect to relieving pressure from high river levels. That's something that we really have not experienced before. And so we're just increasingly confronting questions about how you restore watersheds to pre-settlement conditions, or at least restore them ecologically so they have healthy ecological function, while at the same time recognizing we have so manipulated the hydrological cycle. We have so replumbed this region that undoing that plumbing is something that would probably take decades and billions and billions and billions of dollars.
Yeah, so and that kind of goes right into another question that Roberta asked, which was like, what would be the cost, which you already said, but what would be the benefits of that? Would there be any problems? Would Illinois basically be footing the bill for this? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Well, one of the things that I think is really important when we have a discussion about the Chicago River is there's a tendency to talk about the Chicago River as having once flowed into Lake Michigan, which it mostly did, and that we have reversed it to flow into the Illinois River and the Mississippi River, which is largely true. However, it's a little bit of a misnomer to say that there was a divide between Lake Michigan and the Mississippi River. If you look back over the old historical accounts, they're an interesting read, but if you look back, you've all heard of LaSalle Street in Chicago, the north-south artery in the financial district. LaSalle, one of the French explorers, actually wrote in 1682 about the place where the Lake Michigan basin met the Illinois River basin. And it was far from a very clear divide. In fact, LaSalle often mentions, it's fun to go back and read these accounts for those of you who are history buffs like I am, but he talks about how the area by what's today Summit, Illinois, really was comprised of a place called what came to be called Mud Lake. It was not a very clear divide. In the springtime, the spring rains would fill up in the area and create a passageway called Mud Lake, where you could actually move canoes through and fish could move back and forth through. So I think one of the things that we need to do as we think about the future of the Chicago River and how to keep making it healthy is talk about a divide in the context of an ecological divide, so that we want flood water to be reduced. We don't want people's homes to be damaged, but what we want to do is have an ecological divide that keeps invasive species from moving back and forth between the Lake Michigan Basin and the Mississippi River Basin. And there are ways to do that. One of the proposals right now is for what I call a sanitation chamber. It's just the easiest way to picture this, to be built around Brandon Road in the Joliet area, where barges moving up and down the Illinois River system would have to go through a chamber, be sanitized so that Asian carp and other fish larvae are washed out so that they cannot be carried through to one watershed or the other. Another way to really tackle this area of this subject is to continue to suppress populations of Asian carp. And to do that, I think what we need to do is fish them out, and instead of throwing them in landfills, use them for pet food, use them for people food. I've eaten them, they're fine. Use them as a protein source, even use them as fertilizer. But we have to remember that the Chicago River system, if you trust those old historical accounts, and I don't think LaSalle had a reason to lie, there had not been a concrete or impermeable barrier separating those two watersheds hundreds of years ago.
Yeah, and Annette makes a really good point. Friends of Chicago River is amazing. So if you want more information about the Chicago River and what reversal would mean, maybe go check out their website. So kind of on a different note, Beth asks, is there anything suburban communities and residents can do to improve water quality in the Chicagoland area and Lake Michigan? So how can we promote watershed and beach cleanups year round, not just occasionally or in the summer?
I'm going to politely defer to hold off to see if Luke wants to say something. If not, I'll dive in.
Sure, I see someone mentioned Friends of the Chicago River already, but just talking a little bit about what they do, they work way beyond cleaning up the river. They do a lot to promote recreation on the river, which is really important in educating people about what the river can be used for. And they also work with community outreach. So if you are interested in expanding beyond just going to a cleanup, or you don't want to do a cleanup, there's lots of opportunities with the Friends of the Chicago River.
And that's a great answer. Friends of the Chicago River does wonderful work. I've been out on their volunteer cleanups on the river before. The Alliance for the Great Lakes has an Adopt a Beach program. One of the things that's cool about the Adopt a Beach program is that volunteers collect data based on what they find, and then that data can be used to make policy change. I'll give you a quick example. One of the most commonly found items through Adopt a Beach has been smoking related materials. And so the data were collected, and volunteers took that data, went to their village halls and their city halls and said, look, our beaches are not ashtrays. We should be banning smoking on beaches. That doesn't mean we're anti-smoking, but it does mean that we are finding too much smoking debris on our beaches, and we have the data to prove it. And lo and behold, those volunteers were successful in places like Chicago and Wilmette and Muskegon on Lake Michigan. So really good volunteer programs collect data and then help use that data to create even more change.
And while we talk about beach cleanups, one other option, if you go to chicagobeachcleanup.com, it's a really small organization. It was started by a Prospect graduate, actually. She's a freshman at the University of Illinois, so you can give that a look too.
Awesome. So John asks, Cam, can you tell us how the beer companies are becoming more sustainable by using less water per each can of beer? And if you don't know, that's totally fine.
Well, you know, as it happens, as a beer aficionado, I do ask about these things. I think they are getting much more water conservation oriented. The other thing that you see responsible craft beer makers doing is taking their spent grain and trying to use that to move that out as animal feed or to otherwise find ways for reuse of that spent grain rather than just dump it in a landfill. Other responsible beer companies are trying to capture their carbon dioxide more and more from the beer making, from the fermentation process. Carbon dioxide, of course, is a key greenhouse gas, which exacerbates climate change. So it's a fantastic question. And if you find beer companies that are responsible and trying to do the right thing, it makes beer drinking even more fun.
Awesome, thank you. And then a different John asks, the Army Corps of Engineers has a detailed plan to restore Bubbly Creek. Are you aware of this? What are its chances?
I am aware of it, and I think the chances are good. As always with things like this, there are, you know, bureaucratic things that need to get worked through, but I do think the Corps of Engineers is serious about restoring Bubbly Creek and much of the rest of the Chicago River. And it has been great to see the Corps of Engineers stepping up and working to take that leadership role.
Awesome. So I am out of questions in the chat. So if anybody has any questions, please put them in now.
I will say this,
Yeah, go ahead, Cam.
not so much a question, but just a wrap up. You know, you all elect 9 commissioners to the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District to represent you. So I want to make sure you know how to be in touch with our office. Once we're able to provide tours again of TARP or parts of TARP, we'd love to do that. If you're interested in rain barrels to help harvest rainwater from the roof of your home, we're interested. You can reach me at Davis C, that's DAVISC, at MWRD.org. I introduced Dawn Walker of my staff before. She's at walkerd@mwrd.org. When we get to the point where we are able to kind of be face to face again, we do school group tours. We can help in other ways as well. So please don't hesitate to be in touch with our office if we can be helpful.
Great, thank you so much, Cam. So if there are no more questions, I will hand it off to Liz to make a closing remark.
Thank you, Mary Catherine.
So that was just simply amazing. I've known Cam for many years and I'm still just blown away by how he just talked off the top of his head about very many complex issues. And Luke, you did just an amazing job. So just a couple of wrap up things really quickly. Our office, the Great Lakes National Program Office in which I work at EPA, are offering actually 2 grant programs right now. So if you are affiliated with nonprofits or local municipalities, villages, because I saw some questions on there, what can we do? We are offering grants actually out right now, Sustain Our Great Lakes, SOGL, which is going to help build climate change resistance and resilience. Cam talked about non-point source runoff and what we have to do with green infrastructure, repairing buffer zones. Those are absolutely essential to strengthening the resilience of our ecosystem as we face a changing climate. So do check that out on the EPA website of the Great Lakes National Program Office. The second grant offering out there we just announced is trash-free waters. And so you can get a grant for cleaning up your beaches. So take a look at that. Feel free to contact me. We have my email embedded in here. You can reach out to Heidi. And then I just want to put a plug into our next series, which is going to be on microplastics in the Great Lakes. So I attended a recent conference a couple weeks ago, and 100% of the Great Lakes fish that the aquatic scientists tested had microplastics in them. So what we're going to do is I have a couple colleagues, scientists that actually do this. We're going to have them on, and we're going to then talk about how we all can reduce microplastics. And this, and I know Cam is actually working on this very issue because this has a lot to do with our wastewater treatment plants, which aren't designed to trap microplastics. And they're getting in virtually all of our fish now, but we can do something about it. So that's going to be our next webinar. So I think that's it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. A recording of tonight's program will be readily available on Facebook. And as soon as our volunteers are able, they will be available on our YouTube channel. And more information on our league and all of our programs can be found at www.lwvah.org. Have a great night. And don't forget, next week we are having Jay Nicole Brooks, a Looking Glass Ensemble member and star of FX's Fargo, lead our annual Martin Luther King Jr. movie night. And this year we plan to challenge our viewers to dig deep into how their entertainment choices affect bias. And the program is completely free registration in the chat. Thank you all so much for coming. And we hope you have a great rest of your night.
Thank you, everyone.